Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world listening to us. It's an absolute joy and a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for making a little time in your busy day to share some time just to think a little bit about the Octave study and the implications that might have for the way in which we're going to be using vaccines. Now, it really is an absolute pleasure to have you here. I'm going to give you just one or two background remarks, it has to be said. The purpose of our being here is for us to talk about a recent study, which is an ongoing study, the Octave trial. And fortunately, I only have to give you an introduction to that because it's actually really rather important that it's properly explained. So that's why we have Professor Stephen Siebert and Professor Ellie Barnes joining us. Now, let's me just say very quickly that they are the powerhouse of this presentation this evening. You're going to hear me give a little bit of background. That'll be the starting point. And then Stephen is going to take you through the meat of the key data set that we've released recently as our interim analysis. And then Ellie is going to take us through the similar data set. You'll see that we're covering autoimmune disease, we're covering hepatic disease, so we'll be covering ANCA-associated vasculitis, inflammatory arthritis, particularly rheumatoid psoriatic arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, and chronic hepatic diseases of a variety of etiologies. Stephen is Professor of Inflammation Medicine up here in the University of Glasgow. Ellie, Professor in Gastroenterology, Hepatology down at the University of Oxford. So this is a Glasgow-Oxford collaborative effort tonight. Now, people in Oxford normally don't talk to people in Glasgow, just so you know. So thank you, Ellie, for being so nice to us. And actually, I'll say just a little bit about that when I come to the trial momentarily. A little bit of housekeeping for you here. We are in a virtual environment. How I wish we were able to interact. And in the virtual environment, I need to just disclose a few things. So we have variously been in receipt of either funding or honoraria from relevant funders in the pharmaceutical sector, and Ellie in this particular context has no obvious conflicts to declare. But I want to tell you a little bit about how the website works. Now, the giggling sound you hear in the background are my children, because they heard me say that I was going to introduce you to a software online experience, and they know that I'm barely able to access my own emails, never mind anything that is of more complex nature. So you're going to be on mute for the duration of the meeting. So you could be singing your favourite songs in the bath while you're watching us, and we won't know. So I won't tell if you won't. You can, however, put questions in, and I would thoroughly encourage this. There's a Q&A function. Pop in your question and then send that to us, and we will be very happy to answer as many of them as possible. And for those of you who do know me well, you'll know that the difficult questions will be directed to Stephen and Ellie, and the easy questions I'll try and deal with myself. So that's the usual rules apply. We'll do our very best to take as many questions as possible. So do please get those questions coming in pretty much as the webinar goes. And if you have any problems, just pop in. I'm having a bit of technical problem, and our wonderful technical team in the background will make sure that you know exactly what is going on. They'll fix that for you. So those are the key elements in the housekeeping. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. If I have, I'll get a very rude note in chat shortly. So let's see if I can advance the slide. There we go. Thank you. That's the one I was looking for. So this tells us that at 0 minutes, I'm meant to be talking to you. And then a couple of minutes after that, I'm meant to be telling you about the Octave trial. I'm probably therefore running a couple of minutes late. But what I would say to you is that these timings are pretty approximate. And our idea today is to run through what I hope will be a very logical progression. I'm going to tell you a bit about the background to the study, why we did it, and set up the basic methodology. And then I'll hand over to Stephen, as noted, and he'll tell you a bit about the ANCA-associated vasculitis and inflammatory arthritis data set. And Ellie will tell you a bit about the inflammatory bowel disease and hepatitis, hepatology data sets. Just a quick note, these are interim data, and they're interim because this is an ongoing study, and I'll describe the whys and wherefores of that. And then I'll bring all of this together towards the end of our formal presentation. And then, as I say, we'll open this up to panel discussion, and we'll see how we get on with that. So thanks for joining us. Let's get on with the business of the day, which is a little bit of background for the Octave trial. Now, the slides, they're going to advance for me. That's terrific. I think all of us are aware that one of the wonders of modern molecular medicine has been the advent of vaccines that recognize SARS-CoV-2. Coronavirus, part of a large family of coronaviruses, and we have a number of vaccines that are available for purposes of the United Kingdom. These include the Pfizer-BioNTech, AstraZeneca, Chadox, Moderna, and Janssen products. For purposes of today, we're talking primarily about the AstraZeneca, Chadox, and Pfizer-BioNTech. There were a few patients crept into our study who'd received the Moderna vaccine, and I'll explain why that is momentarily. It's a few fundamental properties of the vaccines with which I suspect by now you are very familiar, mostly to do with either their basic construct. The AstraZeneca is a viral vector, so it uses if you like, a traditional vehicle to get the relevant proteins, the spike proteins, which are a highly immunogenic part of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and therefore the obvious place against which one would raise a relevant immune response. Similarly, with the Janssen product, the mRNA vaccines are different means of bringing the viral protein into the attention of the immune system, but here using RNA intramuscular injection, then expression of that RNA such that the viral proteins are rendered recognizable and therefore likely inducing of an immune response. And remember, of course, that these are slightly different. They're different modes of action, but the target proteins are by and large the same. And so we should be able to measure the same kinds of antibodies, the same kinds of T cells in the assays that we've chosen to use, whether one is receiving any different kind of viral challenge, vaccine challenge. So this is not an experiment about which vaccine works best. Okay, so why did we need more data? Why didn't we just say, look at these fabulous national vaccination programs, let's just crack on and give these to people with chronic diseases? And the answer was because quite properly, the vaccine phase 3 programs were conducted in people in whom, as far as the investigators knew, the immune system was fully functional. And that's because the vast majority of the need was, of course, for people with normal functioning immune systems in the general population who were much in need of SARS-CoV-2 protection. And so that left a question mark against the efficacy, the immunological efficacy, and we're going to talk today about immunological efficacy. In the Q&A, we can pick up some of the strengths and limitations of the Octave study as we go. But you'll find that the general population data need not be directly transferable. However, there was a reassuring analysis provided by Public Health England just a number of weeks ago, which evaluated serology and clinical outcomes in clinical risk groups. And those data were derived from primary care databases. And in general, they reported very reassuring levels of seroconversion in the order of 96 to 100%, which sounds pretty good in my books, and no evidence of reduced vaccine effectiveness. So the question was whether this was a replicable finding using a different methodology, and I'll tell you a little bit about what happened when we did the Octave trial, asking essentially the same question. What is the level of protection that you can expect if someone receives a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2, but whose immune system may not be optimally functioning? So, the Octave trial started on or about Christmas Eve of 2020. The UKRI have an underlying network of investigators led brilliantly by Paul Moss in the University of Birmingham, I have to say, and working together with the British Society for Immunology. And amongst other questions, that group were starting to think a little bit about, well, look, how well do these vaccines work in people who maybe are not in possession of normal functioning immune systems? And over a few days, a consortium came together. It came together from a number of university partners, including Glasgow, Birmingham, Oxford Imperial College, Leeds, Sheffield. And that core group, in fact, we gathered more friends as we went, became a multi-centre, multi-disease prospective cohort study. During January, we discovered that we were not going to be simply an observational study. We discovered that we were of direct interest to the MHRA, and as such, we became a CTIB. And that was, in fact, at the time, an enormous administrative headache, but actually, in retrospect, was a great outcome for us because it meant that we were applying the rigour and meticulous approach of a clinical trial and intervention study to the evaluation of how well these vaccines were behaving in terms of introducing immune responsiveness. And you can read the slide for yourself. The purpose of the trial was to look at the phenotype and function of these vaccines. And we were looking at people with a whole range of chronic diseases. The chronic diseases were rather broad brush. I'll tell you what they were in 5 minutes or so. But they are unified by chronicity and by the likelihood of having some kind of deficit in immune responsiveness. And we brought in a control group, and I'll show you what that is momentarily. And we were interested in the underlying pathophysiology of a disease that might lead to a failed or partial recognition of the vaccine, or the fact that immune medications, immune-modifying medications might be the problem. So, somebody with rheumatoid arthritis, for example, is actually a priori immune-altered. They don't recognize vaccines as one would if one didn't have that disease, but one could also be immune-modified in response to vaccine because you're taking glucocorticoids, a TNF inhibitor, methotrexate, or the like. So, a primary objective of the study, remembering that this is now a CTIMP, the primary objective was to evaluate the magnitude of humoral and this is critical because this was different from Public Health England data, for example, T-cell immunogenicity of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines in people with chronic disease. And in our secondary objectives, we wanted to look at the impact comparing one disease with another and with healthy controls, and to evaluate the impact of different therapies. So the primary objective of what happens, and that's what we're talking about today. What happens? The secondary objectives were those much subtler and actually very important questions that we're working very hard to answer at the moment. What happens when we look across diseases, looking at healthy controls and across medical interventions? The primary outcome measures were the use of an anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibody, an ELISA, measuring the anti-SARS-CoV-2S and SARS-CoV-2N assays. S is the spike protein. That's the dominant target for neutralizing immunity, and therefore is something that we can look at as, if you like, what has the vaccine done? The anti-N is actually against different components on the vaccine surface, and in that the virus surface, and in that respect tells us about whether someone has or has not had a previous native infection. Because of course we were not taking a COVID negative population. We actually piggybacked the study onto the national rollout of vaccines in the NHS in the UK. That's critical. We didn't randomise patients to receive one or another vaccine. We were doing this in the back of the national rollout. And there were some quite significant consequences of that in terms of, did we catch everyone at baseline before they'd had a vaccine? Well, we didn't, because we were coming in, remember, after the vaccine programme started. We were required to take a very pragmatic approach. The immunology is highly sophisticated, but the application to practice, and Stefan will show you momentarily where we did this, it was in very unusual venues. This was a pragmatic rollout. We were interested in seroconversion as defined by greater than or equal to 0.8 units per mil, and no response is defined, therefore, as less than or equal to 0.8 units or arbitrary units per mil. The T-cell response was evaluated using a T-spot discovery assay with Immunotech, and both of these were supported by SOPs. So a sample taken, wherever it was taken in the country, that sample was analysed by exactly the same SOP. So we really are in the randomized control mode. We're in CTIMP mode, and a positive T-cell response was more than or equal to 24 gamma secreting T-cells. For those of you not familiar with this, you take the blood, you put them into the test tube, you stimulate them, and you look for cells that are able to respond to the virus protein. And you know they're responding because those cells that are already primed in the patient will be switched on in the test tube and will release a cytokine called interferon gamma. And that's called, it's like an ELISA where you detect an antibody, but you're now using the cell as the reporter, and that's called ELISpot, hence the name. All right. Now, I've mentioned several times that these were patients receiving either Pfizer or AstraZeneca vaccine as part of the UK national vaccine rollout, and that these diseases, you can read them for yourself, immune disease, solid cancer, mainly breast and lung as it happened, hematologic malignancies, and hematopoietic stem cell transplant, and end-stage renal disease on or not immunosuppression. Today, we're showing you a subset of those data and focusing mainly around inflammatory arthropathy, inflammatory bowel disease, and hepatic disease. And the healthy controls were the patients from the PITCH study, people in PITCH study. Now, these are healthcare workers, so if you like, we've gone in against the blue ribbon. We've tested ourselves against the best. These are otherwise healthy people working in the healthcare service, a bit younger than our population. And we're going to show you data who will eventually contribute to a deep immunophenotyping group. We had one group of patients who were really subject to deep phenotyping. We will know an enormous amount at the end of the day about the immune responses. We're only reporting these primary outcomes, the primary serology and primary ELISpot for T-cell responses. And we're going to show you those for relatively early after 2 vaccine exposures. That deep phenotyping group is 150 per disease subgroup, and there's a broader, up to, in some cases, 850 patients per disease subgroup, rendering an overall study population in the order of 2,000 to 3,000. This is a lot of detail. The samples that we've taken include whole blood, peripheral blood mononuclear cells, serum, saliva, plasma, and we're doing on the right-hand side a whole range of detailed assays. As I say, we'll know a great deal about how the immune system functions. For purposes of today, I don't intend to dwell on the detail, but rather than just give you the flavour that although we're telling you about an ELISpot and an ELISA, in a few months' time, we'll be telling you about very detailed information about the kinds of cell responses that one might expect to be knowing about in a very detailed immune phenotypic way. And at the moment, we're at 2,590. We're probably going to end up just over 3,000 patients at the end of the study. This is a data set that comes from what was an unplanned interim analysis. And for that reason, we've not performed a formal statistical head-to-head comparison. Now, please forgive us for that. Why did we do an unplanned interim analysis at all, you may be asking? Well, the reason is that there was a policy imperative. By the middle end of the summer, it was vital that government knew what the actual responses that these patient groups were mounting against vaccine looked like in order to inform whether more vaccine shots, be they third inoculation, be they booster, were going to look like. And we were asked by government to unravel our data, put them together and present them as best we could. And you'll see that the data are hugely interesting for all that. But be aware that there will be larger data sets coming into the public domain in the next number of weeks. And the data that we're talking about today are on the Lancet preprint site at the moment and may be subject to change as we do that further data analysis and data cleaning exercise. Nevertheless, I am really happy to hand over at this point to my dear friend and professional colleague, Stefan Siebert, based up here in Glasgow, who's going to tell you about the interim analysis that we've done in terms of ANCA-associated vasculitis and inflammatory arthritis. Stefan, over to you, sir.
So thank you very much, Ian, and welcome from me as well. I think I've managed to unmute myself. So as Ian said, I'm going to speak to you about the rheumatology group, and unlike the Public Health England data set that Ian mentioned right at the beginning, which was retrospective using primary care data sets, we did our research in prospectively and in real time, and we were getting high risk people because they were clinically vulnerable. So we had to go to where they were getting vaccinated as part of the NHS program. And so I spent most of February and March in the hydro, which is not my usual habitat. And I'd usually rather go see a live band playing there. But this is what the hydro looked like. It's our equivalent of the O2 Arena in London. And it was set up for a vaccination center. And I can only compliment the NHS on how efficiently that ran and how well they did to accommodate us amidst all the other duties they were delivering. But it gave us an opportunity to be where our patients were getting vaccinated at the time. And we had to be there. And it was a good experience and a different one. And as Ian said, I'm going to speak to you about two groups. And in red on top, I'm going to speak to you about the ANCA-associated vasculitis group. But I would stress right from the front that these were all people on rituximab. So the data I show you does not necessarily apply to all people with ANCA-associated vasculitis, but only those on rituximab. And we deliberately chose that group because we thought they might have impaired immune responses. For this initial preliminary sort of group of reporting, and this is about 150 of our 750 patients who underwent the deep phenotyping. So we were catching them in real time as best as we could. So these are only the inflammatory arthritis group or rheumatoid or PSA, psoriatic arthritis, who are receiving either TNF and or methotrexate, either as monotherapy or in combination. And we obviously captured all the other drugs that they were getting at the same time, including steroids and the other drugs you might be interested in terms of potential immune suppression. And as Ian mentioned, we compared our group to the pitch cohorts, which were the healthcare workers, and they were not part of the study. So and this is not a randomized trial, so you wouldn't be surprised that there are baseline differences between the groups. And I just wanted to highlight some of the key ones here that may have an influence on what our results look like in our patients compared to the healthcare professionals or healthy controls. Not surprisingly, our patients were older. You know, they were less likely to be under 50, which was a lot of the healthcare workers by definition. Our patient cohorts, both vasculitis and inflammatory arthritis, were more likely to be overweight. Again, we know about that metabolic comorbidity of our diseases. The healthcare workers were far more likely to have had previous COVID, about 40% of them, just due to the nature of their work. Whereas in our cohorts, that was about 5 or 7%, as you can see on the table there. And again, I'll show you data why that matters as well. And finally, all of our patients, because that's what was being rolled out at the time, got the AstraZeneca vaccine. But actually, again, you'll remember early on, the healthcare workers were all getting Pfizer. So the majority of the people in the healthcare professional group had the Pfizer vaccine. So there's differences in age. The gender was quite similar, but in a few of the other factors, including previous COVID and the type of vaccine. So the first question was, did they seroconvert at all? So what I mean by that, did they have an antibody response after 2 vaccines? So we looked 4 weeks after they had their second vaccine, when we should be seeing a peak. And the question was, a simple question, did they have any detectable anti-S antibody? And the cutoff for the Roche assay is 0.8 units per milliliter. And you can see that in the pitch study, every single participant seroconverted. So they had a positive detectable response. In the entire Octave study, which includes all of those groups that Ian highlighted in the beginning, about 90% of participants had a response. So already that's looking a little bit lower than the Public Health England retrospective data that we had there. But you won't be surprised that those numbers varied significantly in the different diseases. And I'm going to show you what it looked like for the rheumatic groups. So again, on the left, healthcare professionals, 100% seroconversion, 100% got an antibody response, if you want to put in lay language, with anti-S antibody. You can see that in the inflammatory arthritis group on the right, actually 98% got a serology response after 2 vaccines. What's more worrying and really distinctive is that the vasculitis group on rituximab, only about a quarter of these people had any response at all after 2 vaccines. So that really starts standing out and highlighting that actually our patients haven't all responded the same, and as well as one would hope, as well as the healthy population anyway. So I've only shown you a sort of binary yes, no. So what does this look like if we actually look at the responses with each vaccine? Because I said to you, we captured as many as we could before their first one, at their first vaccine, and then after their second vaccine as well. And I've just shown you the two groups on the right are the hemodialysis. And I'm not going to talk about those, but just showing that even within hemodialysis, if the patients are immunosuppressed on the right, there's less response than if they aren't immunosuppressed. Again, just reinforcing that actually we were right to do the study and to be worried. So these are just the same graph, just with our groups. And what you see on the left is the healthy controls. They have a good response, the blue, after their first vaccine. And immediately, those of you who've got better screens and better eyes than me will see that there's almost two groups there. Though some of them that have a brilliant response right from the off, and some of them that have a more moderate response. And then afterwards, the whole group takes a further jump after 2 vaccines. So again, in our inflammatory arthritis group on the right, you can see that there's a jump after the first vaccine, quite a big spread, and then another jump after the second vaccine. So that's nice that they've had some response, again, saying to you, the majority had some antibody response. And I'm just showing you serology here, just worth saying that again, anti-S antibodies. But again, in the middle group, the ANCA vasculitis, really not small numbers, but not a big jump in terms of first or second vaccine. So we'll come back to that in a bit more detail. So what do these numbers look like? Just looking at groups. If we look at the medians, if you start with the ANCA vasculitis group this time in the middle, you can see that their median antibody level. So not only did they not have a positive or negative, they just really did not budge at all. If you look at the inflammatory arthritis group at the bottom, you can see that, yes, there's an increase after the first vaccine and an increase after the second vaccine. So far, so good. But if you compare those numbers compared to the healthy controls, you can see that, that was a log scale graph I showed you earlier on, but actually they are way more than 10 times lower responses for a median, on the group. So showing, yes, our patients are responding in the inflammatory arthritis, but actually not responding very well, or certainly not to the same level. So the question is that well enough? And the answer, and as Ian said, is this is an immune response study. So we will capture COVID infections and severe COVID infections, the clinical outcome later on, but this is an immune response. And there's still some uncertainty about how much antibody is enough and how much do you need, so no antibody is not good. That's pretty easy, the binary one. But actually, how much do you need? Do you need the sky high levels? And that's something that'll pan out over time. And obviously, we can't wait in our patients, not for this disease, where sort of policy action and research are happening in parallel rather than the more translational format we used to. So if we look at the lowest pitch, so if we start with the red, the healthy controls, if we'd go how many of our patients were below the lowest healthy control after 2 vaccines? And you can see there that even though the vasculitis 86% were, so the majority, 1 didn't respond, and even those that responded, only 20% got within what the healthy controls were doing. But you can see that even in our inflammatory arthritis, who seem to respond, the majority of them mounted some response, that they seem to have a dose response second. But you can see that 50% of them were lower than the lowest healthcare professional. And actually, as it turns out, that cutoff of around 380 is probably where it looks like that immunity correlation with protection and immune response are starting to correlate. So that's lower than one would be comfortable with, if we can put it that, from what we know at this stage. And actually, for our follow-on study, that happened to be around where our cutoff was of about 400 for testing further vaccines. So I'm going to wrap up soon, but I just wanted to show you one more bit on the anti-S. I'm still on serology, and these two graphs are the same, and it's just taken your first group and pulled them apart. And what you can see on the left is, here's the nice healthcare response, first dose, second dose. On the right is the people who've had COVID before. You can see the healthy controls jumped after 1 vaccine. If they've had COVID, they jumped to very high levels, and actually a second vaccine didn't do much because they're already at that level. And that's coming out in a lot of data in other sets. And again, you can see that in our previous rheumatoid and inflammatory arthritis patients, the ones that had COVID before had quite a good response after 1, and they didn't really get much more after a second vaccine. Whereas, again, the vasculitis, a few of them had previous infection and they were higher, but didn't really reach that. So again, just the story that if you've had COVID once, you get a better response after the first vaccine, but actually the second one close together doesn't seem to do as much. And we can maybe discuss that later on. And just to finish off, so far, everything I've shown you has been the humoral, the antibody response. So as Ian described, we did the T-spot tests as well for interferon. and somewhat surprising to me anyway, is that all of the cohorts, including the vasculitis ones, really had quite a good, robust T-cell response within the range seen for healthy controls, despite an apparently, absent for or low vasculitis and lower for inflammatory arthritis serology response. So that's really fascinating, and there's really interesting mechanics behind that, mechanistic stuff. But that's where I'm going to leave the rheumatology bit, and I'm going to hand over to Professor Barnes, who's going to tell us what this picture looked like for the hepatology and the IBD group. Thanks, Ellie.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Very delighted to be talking to you from Oxford University, where the sun is always shining. I can't agree with Ian that I don't talk to people in Glasgow, or that people in Oxford don't talk to people in Glasgow, because I can assure you for the last 6 months, we've been talking on an almost daily basis to make this study happen. But the focus of my presentation, which will be fairly brief, 5 minutes or so, is the Octave results in patients with liver disease and patients with inflammatory bowel disease. And essentially, these are not, even within liver disease and inflammatory bowel disease, these are not a single group of patients. So within the liver disease group, we've got patients with liver cirrhosis. And we know that as patients get more advanced cirrhosis, this is associated with immune defects and a poor response to other existing vaccines. Our hepatology group also consists of liver transplant patients who are on profound immune suppression, and a group of patients with autoimmune liver disease, some of whom are receiving rituximab, like the rheumatology cohort. And then within the inflammatory bowel disease cohort, we've got patients with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. All of these patients are either receiving infliximab, anti-TNF, or vedolizumab, which specifically targets alpha-4 beta-7 integrin on T cells, which has a specific effect on suppressing immune cells within the gut system. So it will be really interesting to compare vaccine responses in patients who are receiving infliximab compared with those receiving vedolizumab. So it's not all one group of patients. So moving on. Sorry, my slides are stuck. Okay, there we go. You can see we had approximately 85 patients with inflammatory bowel disease and the same number who had got liver disease in Octave. The inflammatory bowel disease patients are notably younger than the liver patients. And that's important because, as Ian explained at the start, we captured patients as they went through the national vaccination program. So some of the data that I'm going to present to you today includes a relatively small number of patients with inflammatory bowel disease after the second vaccine, though I do have that data now. And for the liver disease patients, we missed the baseline time point in a proportion of these patients, particularly the liver transplant patients, because they were the very first to be vaccinated within the national immunization COVID program. So just talking through this, you can see the IBD patients are younger. Most people in both patient groups are Caucasian. The percentage of people that had prior COVID infection is very low, 5 to 6%. And most patients had the Oxford vaccine, and we administered that ourselves in Oxford. And actually that kind of contrasts with a healthcare worker study where actually the majority of those had the Pfizer vaccine, as Stefan has already highlighted. Okay, so I just want to describe to you the proportion of patients with hepatic and inflammatory bowel disease that seroconverted. And I think the term seroconversion can be quite misleading, because seroconversion just means any antibody response at all after 2 vaccines. And it can hide a huge amount of kind of really important information, because if you had an antibody titer of 1, that would count as a seroconversion event, whereas a healthy person may have a titer of 12 to 15,000. So this hides a wealth of information. But you can see broadly that 84% of people with hepatic disease seroconverted. The only 4 IBD patients we had in this particular preprint that we published already also seroconverted. The patients here who failed to seroconvert were in fact the liver transplant patients. So moving on, if we just look at the actual anti-spike antibody levels, you can see here the healthcare workers after the second vaccine have really high titers, 11,514 here, whereas the average in the hepatology cohort is 285, and in the inflammatory bowel disease, even though they've all seroconverted, is much, much lower at 733. So there's definitely an immune defect here in the magnitude of the immune response after the second dose in both the liver cohort, but also in the inflammatory bowel disease cohort, even though we're seeing seroconversion. And this is plotted here. So this is a graph exactly as has just been presented to you, with the healthy controls here, with the two groups. These are mostly previously infected people with a really high titers here, and the lower levels here of the healthcare workers. And then if you look here at the hepatology cohort, there's a really broad spread of antibody results, going from really nothing at the bottom, but the median here is much, much lower than even the healthcare workers that were not previously infected. And actually, this is also obvious too, when you look at the levels here after the first dose of vaccine in the inflammatory bowel disease cohort. So moving on. What we've observed here is that approximately 30% of people have a result that's less than the lowest result that was observed in the pitch cohort. And when I've looked at this in all of the IBD patients, it's about the same, it's about 30%. So you can ignore this 0%, which is only on the 4 patients. Actually, the number's about 30% also. So a significant number of both these cohorts are making a suboptimal response to 2 SARS-CoV vaccines. The T-cell responses are relatively well preserved, but I'd say they're not fantastic. We still are going to need to do the formal stats on this. And interestingly, we do have 2 patients in the autoimmune hepatitis group on rituximab that actually have the highest levels of T-cell responses, much like the rheumatology cohort. It's almost like the T-cells are trying to compensate for the lack of antibody response that you see in the rituximab patients. And that's expressed here, where again, you can see healthcare worker median T-cell responses sitting around here. They're there in the others, but they definitely appear to be at a kind of lower mean magnitude. I think that's my last slide before I hand back to Ian. So Ian, back over to you for an interpretation of our results and their impact and our next steps. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ellie, and Stefan as well. What a lovely, clear description of the data set. And an absolutely fascinating data set it is too. Just before I launch into what will be a relatively short set of concluding remarks, I wonder if I could remind you all that the questions and answers, there's a Q&A box, click in it, put in your best questions, we'll do our very best to answer them. And if you can just start to put what's maybe crossing your mind at the moment into that Q&A box, just so that we can build a little bit of momentum for our discussion period. We've deliberately left a fair bit of time for conversation, because that's always the interesting piece. So look, let's think first of all about well, in some respects, the most important. So maybe our technical team could advance the slide, please. There are strengths and weaknesses in this study, and we are very happy to acknowledge both. Eventually, when Octave is fully recruited in the order of 2,500 to 3,000 patients, this is a large study. Consider this: if you had looked in the literature for a widespread immune function experiment in people with immune and other chronic diseases of more than 50 to 100 patients in total prior to 2019, you almost won't find it. So this is just a complete log order in terms of how we've really taken this on going forward. So it's across a range of diseases. So that does mean that some of the groups at the moment are still a little on the small side, but on the other hand, we've got the comparative value. And the piece here is that we particularly if you're thinking about, well, what about your selection of immune diseases? Well, of course, we chose inflammatory bowel disease, psoriatic arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and ANCA-associated vasculitis, because the therapeutics that they entail give us pretty broad coverage of the commonly used immune-modifying medicines, disease-modifying medicines, biologics, and of course glucocorticoid use, which are probably the most important pathways that we'd be likely to be thinking about. We've recruited up and down the United Kingdom. There's geographical spread, and the SOPs that we've used have been very robustly applied, and that's work led by Professor Carl Goodyear, who's been a very vigilant and diligent scientific overseer. And so these different centres really have generated remarkably consistent data at standardised time points, and of course we have control groups available. But the limitations, and we've kind of touched on these as we went through, but I want to just highlight them for you. We couldn't get baseline samples in everyone, and that's because, thank goodness, the NHS was already giving vaccine to people even before we were asked by government and UKRI to get this study up and running. So we were playing catch up from the beginning. And the other thing is that the control group, as Stefan alluded to, is more likely to be female and a little younger. But the flip side of that is that we actually know from population age group studies that the vaccine is generally performing pretty well across the age groups. And the other thing I would say is that we wanted to see what our vaccine responses look like against the best that one could possibly achieve. So why not go for if you like, a blue ribboned control? But it does depend to a little extent on what the question is. We've got heterogeneity within the disease categories, and we accept that. And as the numbers grow, we'll be able to dive down into that deeper level of detail. But at the moment, I hope you'll understand that we're a bit reluctant to do that. We're worried about overfitting ideas, we're worried about overfitting data, and we're really worried about making underpowered analyses and overpowered interpretations. That's always a very dangerous combination, and particularly at a time when there's such sensitive data. Our patients are worried about this, and we should rightly be very cautious about that. We've shown anti-S antibodies, T-cell responses, but there are other measures of the immune system, and as I've alluded to, particularly our deep immune profiling cohort will really strike new ground in understanding about the immune system and vaccine responses in these diseases. And I know we've avoided formal statistical comparison. Okay, so if we look at the next slide, there we go. What do we conclude from all of this? Well, it's an ongoing study, and these are still, although there's a lot of studies now out there in the public domain, very few of them have looked at 2 vaccine doses and at this degree of fidelity and depth. So overall, our patients did reasonably well. 89% of patients seroconverted. Now, of course, if you come from Scotland, where the glass has been said to be half empty instead of half full, that's a misnomer, by the way, but that does mean that just over 10% of our patients did not seroconvert at all. And I think that is important. It's really important if you're one of those patients, or if you're the physician or health professional looking after that group. Note that there were a higher proportion of patients who did not seroconvert in the rituximab-treated ANCA-associated vasculitis group. Note something else, and this is really, really important. We have seen people saying, oh my goodness, 10% of people with these chronic conditions don't seroconvert. That's not the right interpretation. Recall that we disproportionately increased the number of ANCA-associated vasculitis patients into our cohort. They're overrepresented compared to the number of people with vasculitis in the general population. So just be cautious of these generalizations of numbers in the public domain literature. But I think more importantly, we're pretty confident that the magnitude of response across the board in our disease states is a little lower than we would have expected in healthy controls. And although we don't understand what that means functionally, I think it's a good idea for us to be just cautious and start to think about, well, should we be doing better than that? We don't have a cutoff level for functional protection, but that I hope will be coming relatively soon. And then just before I close, we were reassured by the fact that the T-cell compartment is seeing the vaccine. That's enormously encouraging because it does tell us that potentially future challenge, giving the immune system another go at this, potentially in the absence of a B-cell depleting agent, might be sufficient as to raise both humoral and serologic responses. It also tells us, remember, that the immune system has numerous effector pathways that are designed to kill off viruses. And that does suggest to us that our patients may have other modes of defense in place. The immune system is a beautiful and elegant organ. It has these multiple levels of defense because evolution made that an imperative for us. And so we mustn't be naive in thinking that all that matters are antibodies. And I would also counsel you that these are relatively early experiments for us to describe. Now, just before I go into a Q&A session, I want to just show a picture. This is the mugshot alley, and these are the incredible colleagues and now friends who made this study possible. And I'm going to, because Stefan and Ellie are already here, but a particular shout out for Carl, who's got his Hollywood movie photograph look. Carl's led the coordination of all of the sample gathering and assay coordination, and Pam Cairns, who's Deputy CI and who does an incredible job leading the CR UK clinical trials unit in Birmingham, and Sarah, who is an extraordinary project manager for all of us and has just accommodated an enormous amount of work. I've never seen protocols taken, turned around and reimagined for MHRA as quickly. And I need to then go on and mention all of the others, but they know who they are and they're all extraordinary. So that's that. We have in the preprint a whole lot of other names of people, and the font size has dropped a little, but I want to maybe call out particularly Susie Donaghy, who's been the leader of the pitch study, and Susie and her colleagues have just been an incredible part of the team. So team effort, team data, time for some questions and answers. So we're hopefully going to have a nice slide that allows us to do Q&A. There we go, and we're hopefully going to be able to see the mug shots now, but live. We're going to see Stefan and Ellie and myself. There we go, all with our happy smiling faces. And I want to actually just echo what Ellie said, that we've actually become friends because we've been in communication with each other pretty much every day since Christmas. What an amazing group of investigators. When we reduce this down to tables and graphs, and you look at the numbers, you think, oh, goodness me. But you've got to remember, this took place in the middle of a COVID pandemic at a time of national crisis, and I'm hugely proud to be part of that group. Now, let's start to pick up some questions. And I'm going to start, Stefan, just while I draw breath, actually, I'm going to start with a question that comes from Dr. Venkatachalam, which concerns rituximab and timing. And that's a great question, and there are numerous layers. Stefan, why don't you kick off with that, and then we can just think together about how we might be thinking about that going forward. But to you, Stefan, please.
Yeah, no, so that's we have captured that, and I guess the first thing to say is we've captured a lot of data that we simply haven't had time to look at, and that we will be looking at, and that relates to a lot of the drugs. And I'm actually going to highlight a few questions that are linked and try and address them together. So let's. To my mind, we look at what we've shown is there's rituximab in one group and methotrexate and TNF in the other group. And as Ian suggested, we didn't go into this hypothesis free. We were worried about certain patients. They're the same ones you worried about, and particularly certain drugs. And rituximab and steroids are the other one. And we haven't talked about steroids. So I will say that we have captured all steroids within 6 weeks before each vaccine. So we will be looking at that in addition to what we've captured. But we wanted to remove some of the noise in the system. You know, we didn't want people everyone was brilliant. We wanted the people where we thought there might be problems, and rituximab worried us. So to get into the study, you had to have had rituximab within 6 months. And quite a few of our patients had a good 4 or 5 months run up between that. And really the data from other groups as well, saying that definitely rituximab up to 9 months before your vaccine seems to be key. 12 months probably still, but actually we just haven't been, this vaccine hasn't been around long enough to answer that question. And so I think what we can say is that people who are on rituximab who've had it within 6 months and possibly within a year, you know, we haven't even got to that stage, they seem to have a lower and often no antibody response, and that's concerning. The reassuring bit is the T cell response. What does that mean? Don't know. And the real question is, what does it mean in terms of severe infections? And you know, as I said, we can't wait for that to happen. We are capturing that. I will say that a lot of our rituximab patients have recently been hit in the spike, and a couple of them have gone to intensive care. So that does worry me, you know, what's happening in these. And so the rituximab group is, you know, for people who are on rituximab is a worry. And I'm just going to make if you don't mind, Ian, an editorial about clinical comment here as well, is that, you know, we do as rheumatologists treat certain conditions where we have to use rituximab. It's better than the alternative, a lot of steroids, you know, and vasculitis is that example. You know, we don't use that for mild vasculitis, we use that, but we also use rituximab in other diseases like rheumatoid, where we've got choice. And actually, you know, we need to be mindful and have open discussions with our patients. I think that's the best we can do, is do an informed decision-making in someone new starting rituximab. This is what it could mean. And the answer being, we don't know yet. So the answer is, it looks like it's prolonged, and that's not surprising with the half-life of that drug and the way we know that drug works. But we will get more data, and we'll have to see what the tipping point is for how long is safe, how long is long enough, and we just don't know that answer. And Ian, I was wondering, at the risk of speaking too much, but if we wanted to comment on rituximab, or if you wanted me to comment on some of the other drug ones at the same time, or
well, you know, let's just pause for breath, Stefan, just to give you a chance to reflect. There are, first of all, can I say that there's some terrific questions here, and it's lovely to see some very good friends pitching these questions in. So thank you for that. It's good. There's old and new friends in there, so that's just grand. There's going to be some issues around comparing different drugs in the IA space. There's also quite a few questions talking about the interval between the first and second inoculation. Let's do the gap between inoculation first, and then let's start to think about different medicines. Ellie, I wonder if I could maybe take the interval question in your direction in the first instance, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So when we started Octave, we were expected to follow the government guidelines around the interval. So that means the interval varies, actually depending on what the government advice was at the time and the vaccine. So you know, some of the patients receive Pfizer vaccine. That's a 3-week interval. For the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccinated patients, the interval varied between 8 and 12 weeks. So we'll need to do some really careful substratification of the impact on that, on both antibodies and, you know, T cells. But I'd be very involved with the pitch work, where we've looked at the effect of different intervals in healthcare workers that received these specific vaccines. And broadly, what seems to happen with an extended interval, you get an enhancement in your antibody result after the second vaccine if you extend the interval to 12 weeks compared to a shorter interval. However, your T cell response, which is induced mostly after your first vaccine, is just sustained and maintained, you know, irrespective of the interval between your first and your second vaccine. So, you know, part of this depends on whether you're talking about antibodies and T cells. But the crux of all this, I think, is that although you get a higher antibody response after an extended interval, obviously the second vaccine has a fantastic effect on boosting your antibody result. So if you're in a very high prevalence COVID situation, you probably want to get vaccine into people as quickly as possible, a second dose, Whereas if you're in a low prevalence incidence, setting, like we're really not at the moment, then you could afford to extend the interval because the risk of infection is relatively low. And then, of course, when you come to talk about immune suppressed people, there, I think you do want to get the second vaccine in relatively quickly because most benefit is seen from getting that second vaccine in, not the incremental increase you see by extending the interval. So that's my personal view on that. But
Ali, that was,
there are many views on this.
I don't think I've ever heard anyone just actually rationalise that in such a clinically sensible way.
Yeah, it's quite complicated.
So well done. Stefan, do you want to come in as well? I know you've got some other thoughts here. Maybe just get this in.
I was going to take the liberty of asking Ellie and follow-on question to that, because there's a lot of real-world retrospective data out there. And do you think this different interval in different countries could make it hard to compare across countries? And I'm thinking particularly a lot of the initial data is coming out of Israel and the US, where their intervals were very close together, 21, 28 days. And the UK has been 6 to 12 weeks. Do you think we need to be cautious about comparing, that we're not comparing like with like? Because everyone's taking what's happened in America and Israel because they're ahead of us, saying this is what will happen here. And do you think that interval might play out there as well?
Well, yes, it's definitely relevant. The kind of vaccines you get in different countries, the interval between the vaccines in different countries, the population that you're vaccinating, but, most important, the way the pandemic is kind of behaving in a, what's the prevalence and the incidence rates, how susceptible and at risk are people. So actually it's really complicated, I think. But yeah, the interval definitely has to be taken into account. Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I must say, I think just a key take home for me listening to you both is that for those of us managing vulnerable patients, there is this imperative, that you can sense the angst in patients and their families. I can tell you that the Octave investigators have had hundreds as a low-level estimate of direct email communications from people who are just really terrified. And I think just that balance of judgment, particularly at a time when we don't know what a high titer really means. Yeah. It's the Goldilocks hypothesis, isn't it? Do you need daddy bear's porridge to survive? Well, if you're maybe baby bear wasn't giving you quite enough porridge. We're looking for just right, mummy bear's porridge bowl. And at the moment, there is a worry that going for big might get in the way of going for common sense, Ellie, and I think that's what you're laying out for us here very nicely. Now, I want to go back, as I indicated in my preamble remarks around the strengths and weaknesses of the study, we are at a very early stage to be drawing firm comparisons and comparing different drug modes of action. But Stefan, I wonder if I could come back to you, maybe to pick up some of our colleagues' questions about, methotrexate, different biologic MOAs, and then Ellie, as a kind of heads up, if you could maybe talk about the cell circulatory modifiers that are more prevalent in inflammatory bowel disease. But Stefan, I can give you the first shot at this if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, no, so it's great to see you all thinking the similar way we were thinking, and in an ideal world where there's no rush and no COVID raging around us, we would do a randomized trial of all the drugs and all the vaccines and answer these questions. We have to do this in real time, and we probably won't get answers for every single drug. I think that's why we deliberately picked out the highest risk groups. So I've already said to you, we've captured steroids, and we'll look at that. We haven't yet looked whether there's, within our cohorts, whether there's a TNF, a rheumatoid PSA difference. And this group's too small, really. You saw there's 110 people, some of them methotrexate, some are rheumatoid. So, but in our biggest 750, we will be able to look at both between drug differences for most of the big drugs and between disease differences. So even, is the effect TNF monotherapy, TNF plus methotrexate? Is there a dose response for TNF? There's questions about JAK inhibitors. Clearly, we've tried to capture those in our bigger group of 750. I don't yet know how many people there are on JAK inhibitors in there. So we really opened the floodgates for the second bit. There's AxSpA patients in there. There's people with really much more all comers. So we will answer some of the drugs. I think some of the drug numbers will get small, and we'll struggle to maybe address every answer. But I think mechanistically we can we want to be able to reassure our patients. It's not like the vaccine program stopping. So we want people to try and reassure or answer questions so that actions can be taken in real time. And I think the rituximab's a good example, because people are sitting up and saying, well, what else? Questions are coming along. And there's also a good question about lupus. And we did have an amendment to include lupus. In the beginning, we were very drug focused. We did take lupus in, but by that stage, most lupus patients had been vaccinated already. So we probably caught very few lupus patients. There are lupus nephritis in the renal cohort, so they will be captured there. And those are, again, the people you're most worried about, aren't they? They've got bad disease, they've got multi-organ disease, systemic disease, and they're on immunosuppressants and probably steroids. So those are, I think we'll capture the high-risk lupus. We won't capture the well lupus, but I think we'll have enough to extrapolate. But there's lots to do, lots of work to do, and lots of questions to answer.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. It's super comprehensive. It's lovely to see my dear old friend Wayne Sui putting in the JAK inhibitor question, and the answers, of course, as soon as we have enough data, we'll be telling you about it. Ellie, just to some of the more IBD specific medications here, any thoughts?
Yeah. So as I highlighted, the patients are on two groups of medicines broadly: infliximab, an anti-TNF, and then vedolizumab, alpha-4 beta-7 integrin blocker. And essentially, what we see is a more profound effect. We're not the first to show this. There's a fantastic Clarity study out that's also observed this. There's a more profound effect on antibody responses in the patients on infliximab compared to the patients on vedolizumab. And one thing that we didn't mention, Ian, actually in your presentation was that we did bring a subset of patients back one day after vaccination. Indeed. Because there's a key question, I think, about what do these drugs do to your innate immune response? And actually, is it that the kind of mechanism of action of these drugs that you inhibit the innate response after your vaccine, or is it something that happens further downstream as the adaptive immune system's evolving? And I can just give a kind of teaser that there's some early data to suggest that indeed early, within a day after your first vaccine, in the TNF patients, we are observing effects on innate immune cell populations, which is correlated with the adaptive antibody response downstream. So I think there's a huge amount of really cool mechanistic work we can do here.
Yeah, and that fits with the idea that some of the most explanatory genes in terms of COVID survival and progression, rapid virus clearance. Hey, guess what? They reside in the innate immune response as well, Ellie. So I just think the work that you and that group are doing around the innate response is going to be so important. A couple of things I want to just maybe develop this. There's a couple of questions here which speak to actual numbers of infections in our cohort. What we've done is we've linked our patients to using NHS linkage. To actually look at infection rates in subgroups requires very, very large populations, and our study is not powered for that. Our study is an evaluation of immune competence. We can probably extrapolate from that to large population data sets, and those are coming in very fast now. And I think it will not be that long before we have some sense of how much antibody really is enough. And what does a T cell response actually mean? But those answers will come from the healthy general population. And I think we'll have to take I think it's not unreasonable, in fact, for us to take a move from there into our disease subgroups. But I think because we're into the last five or minutes or so of our time together, I want to just highlight the issue of what do we do next? What do you do with somebody who's got no response? There are several questions being asked in this area, and I'm grateful to you for them. And the answer is, well, vaccinate. Well, we'd like to know more than that, wouldn't we? We'd like to really understand what should we give? Should we mix different vaccine types? Should we? What's the timing? What's the expectation? And does the baseline immune level of response have an impact on where you might be going after a third exposure? And we've actually started the study that will answer those questions. It's called Octave Duo. You'll see there's a musical theme coming through here, isn't it? And I blame Ellie. I mean, because that's because this is a virtual interaction. Obviously, if it was a live meeting, I wouldn't dare blame Ellie for anything in case I got a right hook. But we knew we were going to compare with the pitch study. And so this became Octave. And of course, the follow-on to Octave, well, it's a duet. So that's the Octave Duo. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? Anyone would think there was science driving what we were up to here. Anyway, leave that aside for a moment. Octave Duo is looking at the disease groups that we've talked about at the moment, adding actually a couple of others, primary acquired immune deficiency patients. We've massively extended the hematologic malignancy group and hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, continuing obviously in hepatic, renal and a range of immune-mediated disorders. And we're randomizing patients to either the Pfizer or Moderna mRNA vaccines. And we've done that because that'll give us a nice capture of what do you do if you move from the Chadox into mRNA. There's also a subgroup of the patients that have a third randomization arm to the Novavax vaccine. So we're starting now, and that is a shift forward. Now randomizing, and we'll now in Octave Duo be able to answer questions about, well, what happens if you do mix the vaccine? Is there one preferred route over another? And we're capturing the same density of immunological and phenotypic and clinical background demographic information. So we'll be able to give you some much more, I hope, helpful and intuitive answers in that area. I don't know, in each of our respective areas, Ellie, whether you want to comment on Octave Duo in terms of the gastroenterology space, anything you'd like to comment on here?
No, I mean, I'd just like to say for all the disease cohorts, I think it's imperative that we identify the no or the low responders to a third vaccine, because there are alternative therapies coming forward to protect these patients. So actually, I think that's a really important job we have to do, to highlight those specific groups, because unfortunately, what we definitely observed in the last 2 months is that these vaccines, fantastic as they are in no way providing sterilizing immunity, and this virus is going to be with us year on year. So we can be left with a population of patients that we need to identify that may not respond to however many vaccines they have, and then we need to protect them with alternative strategies. So
yeah, no, as ever, wise words, Ellie. Stefan, your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, no, I think I'd echo that really, because we've had lots of discussions in our rheumatology group. What do we do about rituximab? And it's knowing there's a problem is half the battle, isn't it? Beforehand, if we just lumped all immune suppression together, everyone gets treated the same way, third vaccine, fourth vaccine, whatever comes next, But actually knowing the rituximab group have had this problem in Octave, we'll see what happens in Octave Duo. And just to follow up in the end, there's over 300 already had their third vaccine. So that's not time doesn't stand still in COVID. It's running, that's for sure. So we're all trying to run as fast as well. But I think knowing there's a problem in that group and being able to reassure another group. And so the more we can dig down into our groups and say, actually, this group is fine, this group isn't, that's how we do medicine anyway, don't we? We don't treat every patient the same. Vaccine protocols and historically have treated most people the same, high risk, low risk. But actually, this has forced us to be more nuanced about how we think about our patients. And I think as rheumatologists and inflammatory doctors, whatever, and cancer doctors, we don't treat our patients the same way. We have guidelines, and then we treat patients and we treat individuals. And I think that'll have to fit in the government strategy at some stage. But, the quicker the general population and the others are vaccinated, the more we can start saying, okay, here's a small group. These people have got a problem. You need to do this, or we need to do this. This another group. And so I think that this is a journey, and it'll be a long one. And actually, maybe it's forced us to sort out, we vaccinate our patients with flu vaccine every year. It looks like for some of them, it was a waste of time. We've learned so much about vaccines and other things in general that this will change medicine and the way we treat our patients, and we will all benefit. And we have to just stay on that journey and go with it. Although there's, we'd rather not have this testing of our systems.
I mean, a very nice counter group to the rituximab group is the liver cirrhosis patients, where, for example, patients with advanced cirrhosis have a mortality of 80% if they get infected with SARS-CoV-2 currently. The death rate from infection is awful for patients with advanced cirrhosis. And yet Octave has kind of demonstrated that this group have a relatively good vaccine response. So that's a kind of really good news story for that patient group so far.
Oh yeah, well said, Ellie. There's a final question out there. Thanks, Kath. It starts out by saying a bit of a brutal question here. Now, my normal rules would be anything brutal and difficult would be passed instantaneously to Ellie and Stefan. I think I probably better grow a bit of vertebrate behaviour here and do my best. So look, it's a critical question. It's saying, how do we get people to take up vaccine who haven't yet gone that journey? I think there are several elements in the conversation. First thing, the thread that Stefan started, we treat people, we don't treat patients. We don't treat populations even of people, we treat individual people. And we have to try and personalise that conversation. And each person's journey towards a vaccine or potentially away from a vaccine may be a little different. There may be a historical abreaction to a different vaccine. Remember, we do talk about vaccines quite a lot, at least we should be talking about vaccines. SARS-CoV-2 has brought it into sharp focus, but, Pneumovax, the flu shot, shingles, vaccines, these are conversations we have all the time because our patients are immunosuppressed. It's kind of in the label somewhere, isn't it? And so I would first try and establish why people are not coming up for vaccine. And secondly, I would reassure them that by and large, the vaccine profile in people with immune disease is pretty safe. And I would refer those of you who haven't been there to the EULAR COVAX registry. Please go online to EULAR, dial into the COVAX registry. Several thousand patients with immune-mediated inflammatory diseases, mainly of a rheumatic flavour, Ellie, with apologies for that. And for all I know, there may actually be an IBD equivalent. I'm sure there will be. But go and have a look at that. And the vast majority of patients who are vaccinated, who have an underlying immune disorder, who may be worried about that activation event, are actually doing really rather well. And overall, the chance of serious harm coming to vaccine is far less than the chance of serious harm coming as a result of a native infection with SARS-CoV-2, particularly given the prevalence of comorbidities that our patients have, which overlap worryingly with the comorbidities that predict poorer outcomes in those unfortunate enough to have a native infection. So I hope the answer was benign despite the brutality of the question. I'm going to draw our proceedings to a close with a few words of thanks. First and foremost, thanks to you. You've given up your valuable time to join us this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. And obviously in Glasgow, the sun's shining, the palm trees are gently swaying. In the rest of the country, for all I know, the weather may be the same, although actually the weather forecast didn't look that good up and down the UK today. Those of you joining from overseas, of course, I can't even begin to think what you may be facing meteorologically, but I do know what you're facing clinically. You're facing questions from people who are scared. And I hope that the data that Octave has disclosed thus far, interim analysis with that proviso, is at least the beginning of the answer that you will be offering to your patients in the coming days and weeks. I want to thank Stefan and Ellie for beautiful presentations, crystal clear. These are complex data, but they were simplified to a level that even I understood, and that's a denominator that's almost always likely to predict well how those in our audience will understand. I'd like to thank the Cytokine Signalling Forum and all of the technical wizards that sit behind the screen here. I can't advance slides. That probably means I'm not meant to be advancing slides, which is always a good sign. Do feed back to us. Pop along to the Cytokine Signalling Forum. We have podcasts there, and I get to talk to you once a month and tell you about it used to be my summer holidays. Nowadays I don't have such a thing, so I generally talk about the most recent papers in the immune disease cytokine field. The website is a fund of useful information, loads of slides. You can download them and use them for your own purposes, education, whatever. Summaries of the key manuscripts and papers. We're all so busy, and just the crystal clear points are all there. Do fill in some feedback for us today. We want to know whether you enjoyed the webinar. We'd love to know what worked. We'd love to know what we can do better next time. And above all, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you safe and healthy times. These are the most challenging moments for us as clinicians. We're navigating what we hope is the beginning of the end of this COVID pandemic. I suspect it'll have that little tail there. We've got work still to do, but if we work together as a community, if we're data-driven as always and patient-centred, then I suspect we will do the very best job that is possible in the circumstances. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I wish you well. Stay healthy to you and all of your loved ones. Bye-bye for now.